I've lived in Alaska my whole life, so being out in the middle of nowhere never really bothered me the way it does people who didn't grow up here. But there's a difference between being alone and realizing you might not be. A few years ago, my friend Aaron invited me out to his grandfather's cabin for a long weekend. It was somewhere past Willow, far enough off the main road that once we turned onto the last narrow trail, my phone lost service completely. Aaron had been going there since he was a kid, and the way he talked about it made it sound like a normal getaway spot. He described it like a place where nothing ever really happened. That's probably why what did happen stuck with me as much as it did. The cabin itself was small and older, but still in good shape. One main room, a loft, a wood stove, and a little shed out back. It sat in a clearing surrounded by trees, and once the sun started going down, the tree line just turned into a solid wall of darkness. You could stand there and feel like the woods were just watching you back. We got there in the afternoon, unloaded food, and got a fire going. Everything felt normal. We joked around, talked about how quiet it was, how different it felt compared to the city. It actually felt peaceful. It wasn't until later, maybe an hour before sunset, that Aaron noticed something off. He was walking toward the shed when he stopped and said, "Hey, come look at this." I walked over and saw what he was pointing at. Boot prints. They weren't fresh like someone had just been there, but they weren't old either. You could still see the edges clearly in the snow, and they hadn't filled in much. I asked him if anyone else used the cabin. He shook his head and said, "Not anymore. My grandpa hasn't been out here in months, and nobody else in the family comes up here." We followed the tracks for a bit. They came from the tree line, circled the shed, then passed along the side of the cabin before fading out toward the woods again. They weren't straight, like someone just passing through. Whoever made them had walked around the place, like they were checking it out. I said it was probably just a hunter or someone who knew the area. Aaron didn't argue, but I could tell he didn't like it. He kept looking back toward the trees like he expected to see something. Still, we were already there, and neither of us wanted to make a big deal out of it. We went back inside, finished unpacking, and tried to ignore it. That night, we stayed up pretty late talking. The wind had picked up, and every now and then something would brush against the outside wall of the cabin. It sounded like branches, but there weren't any trees close enough for that. Once or twice we both stopped talking at the same time, because it sounded like something moved along the side of the building, but each time it stopped, and we told ourselves it was just wind dragging loose snow or something shifting. Around midnight, we finally went to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was dark, and the fire had burned low enough that the cabin felt colder than before. At first, I thought something had fallen or shifted near the stove. Then I heard it again. 3 knocks. Slow, even, and low on the wall near the front door. I stayed still for a second, waiting to see if it would happen again. It did. 3 knocks. I turned my head and saw Aaron sitting up across the room. He looked at me and whispered, "You hear that?" I said, "Yeah." Neither of us moved. Then we heard something else. A dragging sound across the porch. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being pulled slowly across wood. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate enough that it didn't sound like wind. Aaron reached for the flashlight and got up quietly. He moved toward the window beside the door, but he didn't stand directly in front of it. He stayed off to the side and pulled the curtain just enough to look out. He let it fall almost immediately. I asked, "What is it?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "Someone's out there." The way he said it made my stomach drop. I got up and moved beside him. He shook his head like he didn't want me to look, but I already had my hand on the curtain. I pulled it back just enough to see. There was a person on the porch. At least, I'm pretty sure it was a person. They were standing near the railing, just outside the reach of the light above the door. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could see the outline of the jacket, hood up, arms at their sides. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. Aaron whispered, "Do not unlock that door." I said, "I'm not going to." We stood there for a few seconds, watching, barely breathing. Then the person took one slow step forward, not toward the door, toward the window. That was enough for us to back away. Aaron grabbed the old rifle his grandfather kept inside. I asked if it was loaded, and he said yes, but his hands were shaking. He called out, "Who's out there?" No response. He tried again, louder. Cabins occupied. You need something, you say from there. Nothing. No movement. No answer. After maybe a minute, we heard what sounded like a boot shifting on wood, and then silence again. We waited. Another minute. Two. It felt longer. Eventually, Aaron moved back toward the window and looked again. The porch was empty. We checked the other windows. Nothing. No one near the shed, no one near the tree line that we could see. I remember thinking that if someone had walked off the porch, we should have heard it. Snow isn't silent, especially that close. But we didn't hear anything. We didn't sleep much after that. Every small noise kept us awake. At one point, I thought I heard something near the back of the cabin, like footsteps in the snow. But when I listened closer, it stopped. At first light, we went outside. There were boot prints on the porch, leading from the steps to the window, but the snow at the base of the steps was mostly undisturbed. There were a few partial impressions, but nothing like a clear set of tracks walking up. Aaron crouched down and stared at them for a long time. I said, maybe wind covered them. He didn't answer. We followed what we could find of the prints around the cabin. Some of them were clear, some were faded, but they all seemed to stay close to the structure, like whoever had been walking around it, not coming or going. That's when Aaron said something that stuck with me. He said, "What if they were already here?" I asked what he meant, but he didn't explain. We checked the shed. Nothing inside had been disturbed, but on the back wall, someone had scratched a mark into the wood. It looked recent, just a simple shallow carving, like someone testing a knife. I didn't think much of it at the time. What bothered me more was the idea that someone had been close enough to touch the building, to walk around it like that. Aaron said we should pack up and leave. I agreed immediately. We started throwing our stuff together faster than we had unpacked it. Before we left, Aaron said he wanted to check under the cabin, just in case. There was a small crawl space with a hatch that was partly buried in snow. I remember thinking it was unnecessary, but I helped him clear it anyway. He pulled the hatch open and shined the flashlight inside. Then he froze. I asked, "What?" He didn't answer right away. He just moved the light slightly and said, "Come look." Inside the crawl space, there was a flattened area in the dirt, a blanket, an empty food can, and a plastic water jug. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. Someone had been staying under the cabin. Recently, there were no animals, obviously. This wasn't that. This was a person. We didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then Aaron closed the hatch and said, "We're leaving." We didn't even finish packing everything neatly. We just grabbed what we could and got into the truck. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every stretch of trees looked wrong. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind us. When we finally got back into an area with service, Aaron called his uncle. He explained everything. The prints, the person on the porch, the crawl space. His uncle got quiet and told him to wait before doing anything else. Apparently, something similar had happened the previous winter. A neighbor had reported seeing smoke from the cabin's chimney when nobody in the family was supposed to be there. When Aaron's uncle checked the place, he found the door locked, but one of the beds looked like it had been used. They assumed one of the relatives had stopped by and never mentioned it. After hearing our story, his uncle went out there the next day with 2 other men. They didn't find anyone, but they did find signs someone had been staying there for a while. The crawl space was cleared out. The blanket and food were gone. Inside the cabin, some of the older canned goods had been opened. That alone would have been enough. But what made it worse was what they found in the loft. Tucked behind an old box was a spiral notebook. Most of it was filled with random notes, dates, weather, things like that. But a few pages were different. Those pages listed vehicles, descriptions, partial license plates, and names. Aaron's family members. On one page, there was a date that matched the night we were there. Next to it, underlined twice, were 4 words. Stayed inside all night. When Aaron told me that, I didn't really know what to say, because that meant whoever had been out there didn't just show up randomly. They knew the place. They watched it. They knew when people came and went. And that night, they were close enough to knock on the wall and stand outside the window. After that, The family stopped using the cabin. As far as I know, it's still out there, but nobody goes anymore. I've thought about that night a lot since then. Not about what we saw, about what we didn't. Because if someone had been living under that cabin, watching it for who knows how long, then there's a good chance we weren't the first people they'd done that to, and probably not the last. My uncle spent years flying supplies and mail to smaller communities in Alaska. He wasn't the kind of guy who exaggerated stories, and he usually rolled his eyes when people started talking about strange things they'd seen in the bush. That's why the one story he told me has always stuck with me. It happened in late winter, during a stretch of bad weather where flights kept getting delayed and routes kept changing. He was doing a run that involved multiple stops, mostly routine deliveries, and by the time he got to the last leg of the day, he was already tired and irritated. He landed at a small airstrip outside one village, unloaded a few bins of mail, and was told he had one extra pickup for the return leg. A woman brought out a hard plastic carrier, the kind usually used for dogs, only this one was covered in an old blanket and taped shut along the sides. She said it needed to go to Bethel and be handed directly to a specific address. My uncle asked what was in it. She just said, family things. He told her he needed a better answer than that if he was going to put it on the plane, but one of the local workers stepped in and said it was fine, that everything had already been cleared. My uncle didn't like it, but he was behind schedule and wanted to leave before weather got worse. So he strapped the carrier in with the rest of the cargo. He said the first strange thing happened before he even took off. As he was doing his final walk around, he heard a dull thump from inside the plane. Just one. It sounded like something shifting in cargo. So he climbed back in and checked. Everything looked secure. Then he heard it again. Thump. This time it came from the covered carrier. He stood there looking at it. No movement after that. He asked the ground worker again what was inside, and the man wouldn't quite meet his eyes. He just repeated that it was fine, and that someone would be waiting for it on the other end. So my uncle took off. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then he started hearing soft sound from behind him. Not banging, more like scratching. Slow, uneven, like something rubbing against plastic from the inside. He told himself it had to be an animal, maybe sedated but waking up, and got angry that nobody had told him. He radioed ahead and said he was transporting a live animal that hadn't been declared properly. The response came back confused. There was no animal listed on the manifest. That made him uneasy enough that he considered turning back. But the weather behind him was getting worse, not better. Then the scratching stopped. A few minutes later, he heard what he described as breathing. Not loud enough to fully rise above the engine noise, but enough that once he noticed it, he couldn't unhear it. Slow inhale, slow exhale, coming from behind his seat. He looked back and saw the blanket over the carrier had shifted. Not fallen, shifted. One corner had slipped enough for him to see the vent holes along the side. Something pale was visible behind them. He said it looked like skin. He kept flying. He didn't want to land in the middle of nowhere. He didn't want to open the carrier in the plane. He wanted to get to Bethel, get rid of it, and find out who had lied to him. But then he heard a voice, very faint. At first he thought it was radio interference, except it wasn't coming through his headset. It was coming from the back. He turned halfway in his seat and listened. There it was again, not words at first, just a low murmur. Then one clear sentence. "Don't let it look at me." He said every muscle in his body locked up at once. He shouted back, asking who was in the carrier, but there was no answer, just that same breathing. He radioed again, this time more urgently, and told the dispatcher there was a person in the cargo behind him. The dispatcher thought he was joking. My uncle was not the kind of person who joked on the radio. So when they realized he was serious, they told him to land as soon as possible. Problem was, there wasn't really a good place to do that. He kept on. He said the last 10 minutes of that flight were the longest of his life. Every few seconds he expected to hear tape ripping or plastic cracking from behind him. Twice he thought he heard whispering. Once he was certain he heard fingernails clicking softly against the inside of the crate. When he finally landed, there were already people waiting. He shut the engine down and got out fast, telling them exactly which container it was. 2 airport workers and a trooper came on board with him. The carrier was exactly where he'd left it, blanket over the top, Tape intact. No sound coming from inside. The trooper cut the tape. Under the blanket was a second layer. Heavy black plastic wrapped around the crate. They slit that open too. Inside the carrier was not a person. It was full of bundled old clothing, tied with cord, packed tightly enough that it probably had shifted during flight. No animal. No person. Nothing alive. My uncle felt stupid for about 5 seconds. Then the trooper reached down into the pile and pulled out a small cassette recorder. It was old, battery-operated, and still running. That explained the voice, at least partly, but it didn't explain the breathing, or the scratching, or why there appeared to be pale skin visible behind the vents. The trooper rewound the tape and played part of it back right there in the hangar. It was a woman's voice speaking in a strained whisper. Most of it was in Yupik, but one airport worker who understood some of it got visibly uncomfortable and asked him to turn it off. My uncle demanded to know what it said. The man hesitated, then translated the only English portion on the tape, which was near the end. If this arrives closed, do not open it inside your house. That was enough to make the room go very quiet. The crate was supposed to be delivered to a residence in Bethel, so the trooper took possession of it immediately. My uncle gave a full statement, mostly out of anger at being lied to and used to transport something with no proper paperwork. A couple days later, curiosity got the better of him, and he called to ask what the whole thing had been. Nobody gave him a full answer. All he got was that the intended recipient refused to accept it, and the person who sent it from the village later claimed it contained items from a family house that had to be moved after a death. My uncle said he would have forgotten most of it if not for one final detail. When he was cleaning out the plane the next morning, he found deep scratch marks on the metal floor panel beside where the carrier had been strapped in, not random scrapes from shifting cargo, for long parallel grooves, too narrow to have been made by tools. And caught in one of the grooves was a piece of broken fingernail, not an animal claw, a human nail. He quit bush mail runs the following year. Even now, he insists there was a person or something close enough to a person in that plane with him. And if that recorder had been meant as a warning, then somebody in Bethel is probably very lucky that he made enough noise about it before it reached its destination. A friend of my sister's worked one winter at a small environmental research station in northern Alaska. It wasn't a huge facility or some dramatic military-looking place, just a cluster of connected buildings used by a small rotating team of researchers and support staff. During the colder months, staffing was minimal. Sometimes only 4 or 5 people would be there at once, depending on weather and supplies. That particular week, because of delays, there were only 3. Her, a maintenance guy named Colin, and a senior researcher named Dr. Reeves. The station sat in a flat, open area with almost nothing around it for miles. During the day, the emptiness was striking. At night, it felt unnatural. She told me the first few days were normal, if a little boring. They kept the schedules, logged data, ate meals together, and tried not to think about how far they were from the nearest real town. Then one night, while everyone was in the main common room, they heard footsteps on the roof. At least that's what it sounded like. Not ice shifting, not wind, distinct steps, slowly crossing from one end of the building to the other. Colin went outside with a flashlight and found nothing. No loose panels, no animal tracks, no sign anybody had been up there. Snow around the building was clean except for their own paths. The next night it happened again, only this time they also heard something hit one of the side windows. Just once, a soft tap. When Colin checked the next morning, there was no crack, no mark, nothing at all. By the third night, none of them were laughing anymore. The footsteps started around 1 a.m. and continued intermittently for nearly an hour, sometimes on the roof, sometimes right beside the outer wall, like someone slowly circling the building. They called out over the external speaker and got no response. At sunrise, they inspected the snow again. No tracks. That was the part all 3 agreed on. No animal tracks, no boot prints, nothing. My sister's friend said Dr. Reeves finally admitted then that something similar had happened the previous season. The winter crew before them had complained of footsteps, tapping, and someone appearing briefly on the security cameras near the equipment shed. But management apparently dismissed it as stress and isolation making people overreact. The station had exterior cameras, so that night they decided to stay in the monitoring room and watch. For a while, nothing happened. Then one of the cameras overlooking the backside of the station flickered, just once, and for maybe 1 second, there was a figure standing near the wall, tall, bundled in white, face indistinct. Then the screen cleared and the spot was empty. Colin rewound the footage and the figure wasn't there anymore. He played it back twice. Same thing, static flicker, empty snow. About 20 minutes later, they heard the footsteps start again, directly above them. Slow, heavy, measured, dark. Reeves, who until then had tried to stay rational, went pale and said there was absolutely no way anyone could be on the roof without leaving some sign. Then the footsteps stopped over the monitoring room, and a shadow passed under the frosted skylight. All three of them saw it, a human-shaped shadow moving across the glass from above. That was when Colin grabbed a flare gun and went outside again. Even though neither of the others wanted him to, he circled the building, checked the ladders, checked the utility structures, and came back in less than 2 minutes with snow all over him and a look on his face my sister's friend said she never forgot. She asked what he saw. He said, "There's someone standing out by the marker poles." The marker poles were set out beyond the main floodlights to help guide vehicles in whiteout conditions. They were maybe 60 yards from the station. Colin said there was a person standing between two of them, just at the edge of visibility. Dr. Reeves looked outside through binoculars. He confirmed it. Someone was out there, not moving, facing the building. They called on the station radio, thinking maybe a traveler or somebody stranded had somehow reached them on foot. No response. They sounded the external alarm. Still nothing. Eventually, Dr. Reeves said they had to assume it was a person in distress, and against everyone's better judgment, he and Colin geared up to go out together. My sister's friend stayed inside and watched from the front window. She said the two men walked carefully toward the figure with flashlights sweeping the snow. The wind had picked up a little, enough to make it hard to see clearly. When their lights reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nobody there. Both men stopped. Then, over the radio clipped to Colin's jacket, she heard him say, "Behind us." She looked up from the radio and saw something move close to the station wall. A white shape, low and fast, passing between the building and the equipment shed, not out in the open where the figure had been. Close. Much too close. She yelled into the radio for them to come back. They ran. When they got inside, Colin was breathing so hard he could barely speak. Dr. Reeves kept checking the locks like he'd forgotten whether he'd done it already. After a minute, Colin finally said that when they reached the marker poles, they found no tracks there at all, but they did find footprint behind them. Fresh ones, leading from the darkness toward the station, as if whoever they had been looking at was never really out ahead of them in the first place, as if it had been behind them the whole time. The rest of the night, they spent in the monitoring room with every light on. Just before dawn, one of the cameras caught something real enough to record. The video showed the side of the station, the floodlit snow, and then a face rising slowly into view from below the camera. Not close enough for detail, but close enough to see eyes. Wide open, unblinking, staring directly into the lens. Then the feed cut. When maintenance inspected that camera later, they found it mounted nearly 10 feet off the ground, high enough that someone would have needed a ladder or would have had to be unusually tall to get their face that close. The storm that moved in the next day delayed replacement staff, so they remained there 2 more nights. Nothing happened during daylight, but every night after that, they heard movement outside. Never voices, never pounding, just steps, pacing, once along the roof line, once beside the wall, once right outside the dormitory section, where my sister's friend said she woke to the sound of someone dragging gloved fingers slowly across the outer metal siding next to her bed. When relief staff finally arrived, she left with them and never went back. She later asked one of the incoming workers if they'd ever heard complaints about strange activity out there. The woman laughed awkwardly and said every winter crew reports the walker eventually. Management apparently hates that nickname. Officially, nothing unexplained has ever happened there. Unofficially, She said the station's oldest workers have one rule they pass down quietly to newcomers. If you hear footsteps outside at night, do not look for tracks until after sunrise. And if you ever see someone standing beyond the marker poles, count the people inside before you open the door. A former co-worker of mine drove supply trucks for a while, including some brutal routes in Alaska where you could go a very long time without seeing another vehicle. He told me that most of the danger out there came from the obvious stuff, whether mechanical problems, fatigue. But the strangest thing that ever happened to him involved none of those. He and another driver named Mason were heading south after delivery run, taking turns at the wheel. It was late, cold, and dark enough that outside the headlights the world just didn't exist. Somewhere along a long, empty stretch, they saw a man standing beside the road. The guy was wearing a winter coat and hat, but no reflective gear, no pack, nothing obvious to explain why he'd be out there alone. Mason slowed down and said they had to stop. My co-worker wasn't thrilled about it, but in that kind of cold, leaving someone stranded could easily mean leaving them to die. So they pulled over. The man walked up to the passenger side and waited. That was the first unsettling thing. He didn't wave, didn't look relieved, didn't act frozen or panicked. He just stood there, waiting for them to decide. Mason cracked a window and asked if he needed help. The man said yes, very calmly, and asked for a ride to the next fuel stop. His voice sounded normal. His face looked normal too. Middle-aged, tired, windburned maybe, but there was something stiff about the way he held himself. They let him in. He sat in the back of the truck cab without a word. At first it was awkward but fine. Mason drove. My co-worker stayed in the passenger seat, and the man just sat there looking forward. After a few minutes, Mason asked what happened to his vehicle. The man said it had gone off the road. They asked where. He gave a vague answer like back a ways. My co-worker turned around and asked if anyone else had been with him. The man said not anymore. That answer sat in the cab for a while. Then Mason tried a different question, asking where he was headed. The man named the same fuel stop they were already going to. No hometown, no explanation, nothing else. The temperature inside the truck started to feel colder. My co-worker said he first noticed it because the windshield fog pattern changed, like the heater wasn't keeping up anymore. Mason turned the heat higher, but the cab kept feeling wrong, cold in a deep way, not just chilly. Then they noticed something else. None of the man's clothes were wet. If he had really gone off the road and been outside in the snow, there should have been melting ice, tracked in slush, something. There was none. No smell either. No mud, no fuel, no blood. Just cold. After maybe 10 minutes, my co-worker glanced at the side mirror and saw headlights far behind him. Another truck. He said he felt immediate relief at the idea of another person nearby. Then the man in the back seat spoke for the first time in several minutes. Don't stop for them. Neither driver answered. A minute later, the approaching headlights flashed once, then again. Mason said maybe the other truck wanted to pass, but the road conditions made that difficult. He eased over where he could. The truck behind them stayed back. Then it flashed headlights repeatedly. That got their attention. My co-worker turned partway and asked the passenger if he recognized the vehicle. The man didn't answer. When he looked back, the passenger was staring at him. Not angry, not scared, just staring. My co-worker turned back around immediately and told Mason to pull over at the next safe spot. The man in the back said, much more firmly this time, "Do not stop." Mason stopped anyway. The second truck pulled up behind them fast, and before either of them could react, a driver jumped out and ran to their door. He was yelling before they even rolled the window down. He shouted, "Why did you pick him up?" Mason and my co-worker both turned toward the back seat. It was empty. The door was still closed. Neither of them had heard it open. Neither had felt the truck shift. There was nobody in the cab except the two of them. The other driver came around to their side white-faced and breathing hard. He asked if the man had said anything to them. They admitted he had. Then the guy told them he'd been trying to catch up because he saw them stop earlier near a snowed-over wreck site. There wasn't a stranded man there. There was an old memorial marker. According to him, There had been a fatal crash on that exact stretch years before, and locals sometimes claimed to see a man by the road asking for rides in winter. My coworker thought the guy was messing with them until they all drove back together to the spot where they'd originally stopped. There was no man, but there was a partially buried wooden cross set back from the road, almost impossible to see unless you knew where to look. And near it, sticking out of the snow, was part of an old vehicle frame. Mason refused to say much the rest of the trip. My co-worker kept insisting there had to be some explanation, that maybe the passengers slipped out while they were distracted. Then, at the fuel stop, Mason found something on the back seat, a folded paper map. Not one of theirs. It was old, the kind gas stations used to give away. One location had been circled in pen. They checked it. It was the wreck site. On the reverse side of the map, written in shaky handwriting, were 4 words. I was not alone. My co-worker told me they turned the map over to a state trooper the next morning. The trooper looked at it for a long time and asked if they'd found it in the truck after picking someone up. Apparently, they weren't the first drivers to report something like that. The old crash, according to the trooper, had involved 2 people. The driver's body was recovered quickly. The passenger's body was never found. That was the part that changed the story for me. Up until then, it sounded like one more creepy roadside legend. But if the man they picked up wasn't the driver, then maybe he really had been telling the truth. Maybe when he said, "Not anymore," he wasn't talking about his ride. Maybe he was talking about whoever had been in the wreck with him. And maybe that's why he didn't want them to stop for the truck behind them. Because maybe, from wherever he came from, he thought somebody else was still trying to catch up. When I was in my 20s, I knew a guy named Trevor who did winter property checks for people who left Alaska seasonally or who had old family homes sitting vacant for long stretches. It wasn't glamorous work. Mostly he'd drive out, make sure pipes hadn't burst, check doors and windows, run heat if needed, and report back. He said one property near Nome bothered him more than any other. The house sat just outside town, far enough away that it felt isolated, but close enough that you could still convince yourself it wasn't. It was an older place with sagging porch, pale siding, and a detached garage that leaned slightly from frost movement. The owner lived out of state and only visited during summer. Trevor's first check was uneventful, except for one detail. Someone had left a lamp on in an upstairs room. He assumed he'd simply misunderstood the instructions, and that maybe the owner wanted one light left on to make the place look occupied. He shut it off anyway while checking the rest of the house. 2 weeks later, he returned. The same lamp was on again. He knew he had turned it off. He remembered because the pull chain had nearly come off in his hand. That made him stop and do a more careful inspection. Doors still locked, windows secured, no sign of forced entry. No fresh tracks around the house, except his own. He called the owner, who sounded surprised and said nobody should have been there. Trevor asked if anyone else had a key. The owner said only a cousin in town did, but the cousin was in Anchorage for work. Trevor told himself it had to be faulty wiring. Then he went into the upstairs bedroom where the lamp sat. The bedspread had been folded back. Not much, just enough to look like someone had sat on the edge of the bed and then stood up. Trevor reset everything, documented it, and left. The third visit was worse. This time, before he even unlocked the front door, he noticed smoke on the inside of one of the windows. Not from fire, more like the faint greasy residue that builds up when people have been cooking. Inside, the house was warmer than it should have been. Not comfortable warm, occupied warm. He checked the kitchen and found a mug in the sink with a brown ring inside. There was also a spoon on the counter that hadn't been there before. He called out, thinking maybe someone really had gotten in and was still there. No answer. He checked every room. Nothing. Then, while standing in the hallway downstairs, he heard a soft creak from above him. One single floorboard. He went still. Then another creak. The upstairs bedroom. Trevor wasn't a timid person, but he said there was something uniquely horrible about being inside a house you know should be empty and realizing you're not alone. He went up slowly, calling out again. No answer. At the top of the stairs. He looked toward the bedroom. The door, which he was certain he had left open while checking earlier, was almost closed now. He crossed the hall and pushed it open. The room was empty. but the lamp was on, and in the dust on the windowsill, someone had drawn a long line through it with a fingertip. He left right away that time and told the owner he wouldn't go back without someone accompanying him. A local handyman went with him on the next visit. Trevor didn't tell the guy every detail because he didn't want to sound crazy. He just said the house might have a trespasser. Together, they checked the place top to bottom. No one, no signs. The handyman started teasing Trevor about it until they got to the garage. Inside the garage, among old tools and boxes, was a narrow staircase leading up to a small storage loft. Trevor said he had never gone up there before because it seemed packed with junk and wasn't part of the main house. The handyman climbed up first, shined his light around, and went silent. Trevor joined him. There, behind some stacked boards and an old snow machine cover, was a little hidden space someone had cleared out. A sleeping bag, food wrappers, an empty water jug, 2 candles burned halfway down. Someone had definitely been staying there. That should have made Trevor feel better, because it meant there was a normal explanation. It didn't, because the loft space had no clear view of the upstairs bedroom window where the lamp kept being turned on. Whoever had been sleeping there would have had to cross the yard and enter the house each time, and there were still never any tracks. The handyman called the troopers, who came out later that day. They searched both structures but found no person and very little useful evidence. Most of the food wrappers were old. The sleeping bag was generic. No ID, no clothing, no obvious clue. Trevor assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, the owner's cousin finally returned to town and offered to meet Trevor at the property. Trevor agreed mostly because he wanted somebody familiar with the family to explain why that house felt so wrong. The cousin was a quiet, older man. On the drive out, Trevor told him about the lamp, the mug, the hidden sleeping area, all of it. The cousin listened without reacting much. Then he asked, "Was it the blue lamp in Ellen's room?" Trevor said yes. The cousin nodded like that confirmed something and said Ellen had been the owner's sister. She used that bedroom before she died, one winter about 15 years earlier. The way she died made the story worse. According to the cousin, Ellen lived in a house alone for part of the year and had become convinced someone was getting in while she slept. She told relatives objects had been moved, lights were being switched on, and she could hear people walking in the hallway at night. Nobody believed her. They thought she was isolated, anxious, maybe imagining things. Then one stormy night, she called her brother in a panic and said someone was in the house again. By the time anyone got there the next day, she was dead in the bedroom. Natural causes, technically. That's how it was written up. But Trevor said the cousin got quiet after telling him that and added one last detail. The blue lamp had been found on, even though Ellen always unplugged it before bed because the pull chain was broken and she didn't trust the wiring. Trevor considered leaving right then, but the cousin wanted to check the place. They went inside together. Everything seemed normal. No mug, no creaks, no warm air. For almost 20 minutes, Trevor started feeling embarrassed for ever being afraid of the place. Then the cousin, who had been standing in the kitchen, slowly looked toward the hallway and asked, "Did you bring someone else?" Trevor said no. The cousin pointed. At the far end of the hallway, just before the stairs, a person had briefly leaned out from around the corner and pulled back. Trevor only caught a flash of movement and pale hair, but it was enough. The two of them ran to the stairs together. Upstairs was empty. The bedroom lamp was on. Trevor says he never touched that house again after that day. The owner eventually sold it cheap, and last I heard the place was renovated and occupied by another family. Maybe nothing ever happened there again. Or maybe whatever had been using those empty seasons didn't like the house being watched too closely. Because the most unsettling explanation Trevor ever came up with wasn't that Ellen was imagining things. It was that she was right. And by the time anybody took her seriously, she wasn't there to explain what exactly had been sharing that house with her. My older brother worked commercial fishing in Alaska for a few seasons, mostly because the money was good and he was young enough to ignore how miserable the work could be. He came back from one season quieter than usual, and after a lot of pressing, he finally told me why he never wanted to go out on that particular boat again. They were in rough weather, but not disaster-level weather, the kind where everything is miserable but still manageable. Visibility was bad, the deck was slick, and everyone was already on edge because they had been having radio issues earlier in the day. Near midnight, while they were anchored and waiting for conditions to improve, the radio on Channel 16 crackled on. Anybody who has spent time around boats knows Channel 16 gets attention immediately because that is where emergencies come through. At first it was static. Then a man's voice came in weak but clear enough to understand. He gave coordinates and said his vessel had lost power. He asked for immediate assistance. The captain wrote the coordinates down and checked them. The boat should have been close. Close enough that if another vessel were actually out there, they might have been able to spot a light through breaks in the weather. But they saw nothing. The captain tried responding, asking for the vessel name, number of people aboard, anything. The voice did not answer those questions. It just repeated the same distress call, word for word, in the same tone and rhythm, like a recording. One of the deckhands joked about it being a prank, and nobody laughed. Then the voice changed. It said very clearly, "Can you see us now?" My brother told me every person in the wheelhouse went completely still after that. Nobody on their boat had said anything about seeing lights. Nobody had told the radio their exact orientation. Nobody had answered beyond asking for identification. The captain tried transmitting again. No answer. Then the voice returned, no longer weak at all. "Come outside." The captain shut the radio off completely, not turn the volume down. Shut it off entirely. There was silence for maybe 3 seconds. Then there came a knock from the outside of the wheelhouse window. 3 taps. My brother was standing nearest the door and turned just in time to see what looked like fingers slide down the glass from the outside. Pale fingers. Bare. They all stared at the window. Nobody moved. The temperature outside was well below freezing with spray and wind. Nobody in their right mind would be standing on the outer walkway with bare hands, especially not without being heard climbing up or banging for help. The captain grabbed a spotlight and swept the deck. Nothing. He checked the stern camera feed. Nothing obvious. No extra vessel. No person. No debris. For the next half hour, every few minutes the radio, still powered off, gave short bursts of static. Not enough to make sense. Just enough to remind everyone it was there. The captain finally ordered 2 men, including my brother, to do a fast visual inspection of the deck in pairs. He did not want anyone alone. My brother said stepping outside felt like stepping into a different world. The boat rocked under them. The wind cut through every layer, and beyond the work lights there was only blackness and spray. He and the other deckhand checked lashings, railings, and the walkway beneath the wheelhouse windows. That is where they found the print. On the thin layer of salt and ice below the window was one clear footprint, bare, toes visible. My brother said he almost slipped because he stopped so suddenly. The other guy just stared at it and said, "No," not like he was disagreeing, more like his brain rejected it. They checked for more prints. There were none, just a one, positioned exactly where a person would have stood to tap the glass. They went back inside immediately. Nobody slept the rest of the night. Near dawn, the weather eased enough that the captain decided to move and put more distance between them and those coordinates. Before they left, he powered the radio back on to test it. Instantly, the same voice came through. No static first. No delay. Just a man's voice saying in a calm tone, "You were closest." Then silence. They reported everything once they got back to port. An older harbor worker apparently listened to the story and asked a question that made everyone uneasy. Did the voice sound young or old? My brother said middle-aged, maybe. The harbor worker nodded and told them there had been a distress call years earlier from a small vessel that went down in freezing conditions during bad weather. The last known position was not exact, but it was somewhere near where my brother's captain had written the coordinates. Most of the crew were recovered. One man was never found. The strange part was what happened after that. For several winters, other boats occasionally reported brief calls on Channel 16 from a vessel matching no registered ship in area. The messages were inconsistent, but few of them had one phrase in common. "Can you see us now?" My brother tried to laugh it off when he first told me. He said people on the water get weird, that fatigue plays tricks on you, that radios pick up all kinds of interference. But then he told me the part he did not put in the official report. When they got back to port and started unloading, he went below deck to grab one of his bags from the bunk area. Resting on top of it was a wet coil of rope he did not recognize. Tied into the rope was a small brass tag from an old life jacket. Stamped onto it was a last name. Later, when he asked around discreetly, that name matched the missing crewman from the sinking. My brother threw the tag into the harbor and never sailed that route again. What gets me is not just the voice or the footprint, or even the powered-off radio spitting static. It is a line, "You were closest," because that does not sound like a random haunting or a weird residual replay of an accident. That sounds personal. That sounds like something out there knew exactly who had heard it, exactly who could have come, and exactly who had chosen not to. A guy I knew through work named Luke was really into backcountry hunting and camping. He was experienced, not reckless, and not the kind of person who tried to turn every strange noise in the woods into a monster story. That is why I believed him when he told me this. He and two friends planned a late-season hunting trip in the Brooks Range. They had done similar trips before and knew what they were getting into: cold nights, long hikes, isolation, and the understanding that once you were out there, help was not close. They set up a simple camp near a narrow valley with decent visibility and put a couple trail cameras around the perimeter, more for wildlife curiosity than security. The first 2 days were completely normal. They saw signs of caribou, cooked over a small stove, and slept in shifts mostly, because one of them was paranoid about bears, even though that was not really the main concern that time of year. On the third morning, Luke checked one of the cameras and found several nighttime photos that made no sense. Around 2:13 a.m., the camera had captured an image of a person standing at the edge of camp. The person wore what looked like heavy winter clothing, but no visible pack, no headlamp, nothing reflective. The figure was too far and too partly obscure for facial features, but it was unmistakably human. Luke first assumed one of his friends had wandered out of his tent during the night. He showed them the picture. Both denied it. One of them had been asleep the whole time. The other had only gotten up once to use the bathroom in the opposite direction from where the figure appeared. Then they checked the timestamps. There were 6 images total. In the first, the figure stood near the tree line. In the second, it was closer. In the third, closer still. By the fourth image, it should have been almost directly in front of the camera, but the fourth frame was empty. The fifth showed the figure on the other side of camp, farther away again. The sixth was just darkness. They searched the area, expecting to find tracks. None. The ground conditions should have shown something, especially that close to camp, but there was nothing they could clearly attribute to a human approaching during the night. One of Luke's friends wanted to leave right then. Luke thought that was overreacting. He said it was creepy, sure, but there had to be an explanation: camera glitch, distorted animal shape, somebody else camping nearby. So they stayed. That evening they moved the cameras, tightened their camp setup, and agreed that if anyone heard anything during the night, they would wake the others immediately. Luke woke around maybe 3 a.m. to the sound of fabric moving outside his tent. Not footsteps, more like a slow brushing along the tent wall. He whispered to one of his friends, who answered immediately, which meant he was awake too. The brushing sound continued for another few seconds, moved along the outside of Luke's tent, and stopped near the back where there was no zipper or entry. Luke grabbed his light and shined it through the tent fabric. Nothing visible. Then one of his friends from the next tent over said, "There is someone outside." No panic in his voice, just disbelief. Luke unzipped his tent enough to shine the light out. The beam caught only tundra, low brush, and darkness. No person. But from somewhere just beyond the edge of camp, maybe 30 feet away, came a single whistle. Not wind, a human whistle. Short, low, and deliberate. Luke yelled out, demanding to know who was there. No answer. A few moments later, from farther away in the dark, the same whistle came back. That was when the third friend started insisting they pack up at first light and leave. Nobody argued anymore. They stayed awake the rest of the night and heard the whistle 3 more times from different directions around camp. Never close enough to pinpoint. Never repeated in a pattern they could use. At dawn they packed fast. Before leaving, Luke grabbed the cameras. When they reviewed the second night's footage later, it was worse than the first. One camera had captured nothing unusual. The second recorded several empty frames, triggered for no obvious reason. The third showed something standing directly behind Luke's tent, not touching it, not illuminated clearly, just a tall human silhouette close enough that if it had leaned forward, it could have put a hand on the tent wall. The timestamp was from the exact minute Luke had heard the brushing noise. The image after that was corrupted. The one after that showed the silhouette farther away near the edge of camp. Again, no tracks were ever found in the area where it stood. Luke said he would probably have dismissed the whole thing as creepy, but explainable if not for what happened on the hike out. A few miles from camp, while moving through a narrow section of valley, they found an old campsite tucked into a shallow rise off the trail. It looked abandoned for a long time, collapsed fabric, rusted stove parts, half-buried gear. What caught Luke's attention was a weathered metal box among the debris. Inside were some old supplies and a water-damaged notebook. Most of the writing was ruined, but a few pages were still readable. The notebook belonged to a hunter from years earlier, maybe decades. Dates were hard to make out, but the entries describe hearing whistles around camp at night and finding a person standing just beyond firelight who disappeared before morning. One line was still clear enough to read completely. "It waits until one of us wakes up." That line bothered Luke more than anything else because it fit exactly how his trip had felt. Whatever was around them at night had not rushed the tents or made noise like an animal investigating food. It seemed to want them aware of it, seemed to want them frightened. They turned the notebook over to a local office when they got back, mostly because Luke thought maybe it could help identify whoever had camped there originally. Weeks later, he got a call from someone asking follow-up questions about the location. The person mentioned, almost casually, that the region had a small history of disappearances involving solo hikers and hunters. Not enough to make headlines outside Alaska, but enough that locals knew certain valleys had reputations. Luke asked if any bodies had been recovered near that abandoned campsite. There was a pause. Then the person said, "Not complete ones." Luke never went back. The last thing he showed me was one of the trail photos on his phone. He had zoomed in on the figure standing behind his tent. The quality was bad, grainy, distorted by darkness. But one detail was still visible. The head was not turned toward the tent. It was turned toward the camera, like it knew exactly where it was, like it had been aware the entire time that it was being watched, and maybe wanted proof later that it had really been there. A guy I used to work with named Aaron spent one winter doing overnight security at a remote airstrip in western Alaska. It was not a big airport, just a long gravel runway, a small heated building, a fuel tank setup, and a couple storage structures. Most of the time, nothing happened. Planes came during the day, usually small cargo flights or occasional charters, and at night the place was completely empty. His job was to stay there overnight, keep the generator running, monitor radios, and make sure nobody messed with equipment. It sounded easy, but the isolation got at people. The nearest town was about 20 minutes away by truck in good conditions, and during storms it might as well have been hours. Aaron said the first couple weeks were boring. He would sit inside, drink coffee, watch downloaded shows, and do routine checks every hour. The checks were simple. Walk the perimeter, look at the fuel tanks, check the hangar doors, and then come back inside. Everything was predictable. That is why the first strange thing stood out immediately. One night during his 2 a.m. check, he noticed a set of tracks in the snow near the runway lights. They were human footprints, spaced evenly like someone walking at a normal pace. That was odd because no flights had come in late that night, and nobody was supposed to be there. He followed the tracks with his flashlight. They came from the edge of the runway, moved parallel to it for about 50 yards, and then stopped. Just stopped. No turn, no backtracking, no sign of where the person had gone. He assumed the wind had covered the rest, or that he just could not see them clearly in the dark. He finished his check and went back inside. The next night, the same thing happened. Different spot, same kind of tracks, appearing from nowhere, continuing for a short distance, then ending abruptly. He started checking more carefully. He even took photos on his phone to show his supervisor. The supervisor brushed it off and said it was probably old tracks partially filled in and reshaped by the wind. That explanation sounded reasonable enough, but it did not explain why Aaron kept seeing them freshly defined every night. After about a week of this, he started noticing something else. During his indoor shifts, sometimes he would hear faint sounds from outside. Not loud enough to be obvious, just small things like a crunch or a shift, like someone stepping on packed snow. Every time he went out to check, there was nothing there except the same kind of partial tracks somewhere on the property. One night, he decided to stay outside longer during his patrol instead of going right back in. He shut off his flashlight and stood near the edge of the runway, letting his eyes adjust. The darkness out there was complete beyond the reach of the building lights. After a minute or two, he started to hear it again, a slow, deliberate crunch. Then another, not random, controlled, like someone walking carefully. He turned his light on and swept it across the open ground. Nothing. The sound stopped instantly. He waited. Silence. Then, behind him, closer to the building, the sound came again. One step, then another. He spun around and pointed the light back toward the building. Still nothing visible. No movement, no figure, no obvious source. But the sound had been real, and it had been closer that time. He went back inside faster than usual and locked the door behind him. From that point on, he started doing his checks quicker and staying inside more. He told himself it was just the environment playing tricks on him. Extreme quiet, extreme darkness, and isolation could do that. That was what he believed until the radio started acting up. The radio was supposed to stay quiet overnight unless there was an incoming flight or an emergency call. One night, around 3 a.m., it clicked on briefly. Not a full transmission. Just a burst of static, like someone had keyed the mic and released it. Aaron picked it up and listened. Nothing followed. He waited a minute, then set it back down. About 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, after the static, there was a faint sound. Not words exactly, more like breathing, slow and uneven. He spoke into the radio, asking if anyone was there. No response, just silence. Then the channel went dead again. He reported it the next morning, and maintenance checked the system. They found nothing wrong. They said it was probably interference or a loose connection somewhere. Aaron tried to accept that explanation, but the timing felt too specific. It always happened during the same part of his shift, always late, always when the airstrip should have been completely empty. A few nights later, things escalated. During one of his routine checks, he found a set of footprints leading directly to the door of the main building. That had never happened before. The tracks were clear, deep, and fresh. They came straight from the runway, approached the door, and stopped right in front of it. He stood there for a long time staring at them. There were no tracks leading away, just the ones coming toward the door. He checked the handle. It was still locked. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside, half expecting to find someone already in the building. Nobody was there. Everything was exactly as he had left it. He went back outside and checked again. The tracks were still there, ending at the door. No sign of anyone leaving. That was the first time he seriously considered quitting. Instead, he started leaving one of the exterior lights off on purpose, so he could watch how the darkness behaved around the building. He figured if someone was actually out there, he might catch movement more easily without everything being fully lit. One night, during another long stretch around 3 a.m., he was sitting inside when he noticed something through the window. In the darker section where he had left the light off, something shifted. Not a clear shape, just a distortion, like something had passed through the edge of the darkness. He stood up slowly and watched. Nothing else moved. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and heavy. He walked toward the area where he had seen the movement. The snow there looked untouched at first glance. Then he saw it, a single footprint, right at the edge of where the light faded into darkness. He moved closer. Another footprint appeared a few feet ahead. Then another, each one only becoming visible as he approached, like they had not been there until he got close enough to see them. He stopped walking. The next footprint was about 10 feet ahead of him. He waited. Nothing happened. Then, slowly, a new impression formed in the snow, right in front of his eyes. The snow compressed downward, shaping into a footprint as if an invisible foot had just stepped there. Aaron backed up immediately and returned to the building. He locked the door and did not go back outside for the rest of the shift. The next morning, he tried to explain what he had seen, but even as he said it out loud, it sounded impossible. His supervisor told him to take a couple nights off. When he came back, someone else had covered his shifts. That guy refused to talk about what he experienced, only saying that the place felt wrong at night. Aaron finished out his contract, but never worked overnight there again. The last thing he told me stuck with me more than anything else. On his final night, just before sunrise, the radio came on one last time. Clear this time. No static, no distortion, just a voice. Calm, steady, and close. It said, "You stop going outside." Aaron did not respond. He just sat there listening. After a few seconds, the voice spoke again. That was a good decision. Then the radio went silent and never made another unexplained sound for the rest of his shift. He said he packed up his things early that morning and left as soon as the sun came up. What bothers me about his story is not just the footprints or the voice or the feeling of something moving around out there. It is the idea that whatever was at that airstrip noticed his behavior. Not just that he was there, but that he had changed what he was doing, that it understood caution, that it reacted to it, because that means it was not random. It was paying attention the entire time, just waited to see how far he would go before he decided to stop. A few years ago, I worked with a man named Daniel who spent one winter in Alaska doing emergency generator maintenance for remote public buildings. He was in his late 30s at the time, divorced, trying to make money fast, and willing to take jobs that most people avoided. The company he worked for had contracts with small clinics, school buildings, utility sheds, and village offices that depended on backup power during storms. Most of the work was routine. A generator would fail or start acting up. Someone would call it in, and Daniel or one of the other techs would get flown out or driven in depending on the location. He told me most of the places blurred together after a while. The buildings were usually plain, functional, and isolated. But one job near the Bering Sea never left him. He said it started like any other service call. A village office building outside a small coastal community had been having power issues during overnight storms. The local operator said the main building lights were coming on at odd hours. The generator was cycling when it should not have been, and a side door alarm kept tripping even though nobody found signs of entry. The village wanted the system inspected before things got worse. Daniel expected a one-day fix. He flew in with tools, replacement parts, and enough food for 2 nights in case the weather turned. By the time he arrived, it was already late afternoon, and the sky had that dull gray color that makes everything in winter look flatter and farther away. A local maintenance coordinator picked him up at the airstrip and drove him to the building. It sat a little outside the village center, not totally alone, but separated enough that once the weather shifted, it felt cut off. The place was a low, rectangular structure with offices in front, a records room, storage space, a utility room off the back where the generator controls were housed. Nothing about it looked creepy. Just government walls, metal doors, fluorescent lighting, and practical furniture. Daniel started his inspection right away. He found a few legitimate issues in the utility room. One relay was worn, a battery connection looked corroded, and the alarm contacts on the side door were touchy enough to cause false trips in hard wind. None of that seemed unusual. He replaced what he could that evening and told the coordinator he would stay overnight in the building so he could monitor the generator cycle under real conditions. The coordinator looked relieved at that and said he would leave a radio, extra coffee, and the number for the village public safety officer in case anything happened. Daniel asked what anything meant more as a joke than anything else. The man hesitated for a second and said the weather changed fast out there, and sometimes people wander when they should not. Daniel assumed he meant drunks or somebody looking for a warm place to get inside. That was believable enough. He had run into that before in other remote jobs. Once the coordinator left, Daniel made himself at home in the break room near the front offices. There was an old couch, a microwave, a sink, and a table with mismatched chairs. He ate canned soup, filled out paperwork, and listened to the wind start building outside. At around 9 p.m., the generator performed its first odd cycle. The building lights dimmed. The backup system clicked on for a few seconds, and then everything returned to normal. Daniel went to the utility room, checked his work, and found nothing obviously wrong. He spent about half an hour tracing wiring and double-checking the transfer controls. Everything tested clean. While he was working, he heard the side door alarm chirp once and silence itself. He checked the monitor panel. It registered as a brief open-close event. He walked to the side hallway and found the door shut and locked. When he opened it, the cold hit hard, and the snow outside was blowing so thick he could barely see the fence line. No footprints. No person. He closed it, reset the alarm, and went back to work. Around 11 p.m., it happened again. Not the power issue this time. The side door alarm chirped twice, then went silent before he even got to the hallway. He checked the door. Still locked. Still no visible tracks outside, though by then the snow was moving enough that it could have buried almost anything within minutes. He called the coordinator on the radio and told him the alarm was still acting up. The coordinator sounded half asleep and said to just disable that one zone until morning if he needed to. Daniel said he would rather leave it active for the night, if possible, and keep testing. Before signing off, the coordinator added something that Daniel did not think much of at the time. He said, "If you hear knocking, do not assume it's the wind. Check the camera first." Daniel asked what he meant, but the man just repeated that the side door camera still worked even if the alarm contacts were bad. Then he said goodnight. Daniel thought it was a strange way to phrase it, but he let it go. A little after midnight, while he was sitting at the break room table entering serial numbers into his laptop, he heard a sound from somewhere deeper in the building. Not knocking exactly, more like a slow bump against the wall. Then another. He listened. Silence. He got up and walked the offices with a flashlight, even though the lights were on. Everything was in order. No open windows, no loose panels, no obvious source. The records room door was shut. The front entrance was locked. He checked the side hallway and stood there for a second just listening to the weather press against the outer walls. Then, from the side door, 3 slow knocks sounded from the other side. Not loud, not frantic, just deliberate. Daniel froze. He told me later that what bothered him most was the rhythm. It did not sound like wind-driven debris or ice hitting metal. It sounded exactly like a person using their knuckles. He remembered what the coordinator had said and went to the small monitor station near the front desk. There were only 3 camera feeds, one on the front entrance, one aimed at the generator fuel setup, and one on the side door. The front and fuel feeds showed blowing snow and nothing else. The side door camera showed the door, the short concrete step below it, and the drifting white darkness beyond. There was no one there. He kept watching, thinking maybe whoever had knocked had already moved out of frame. Nothing. Then the knocks came again, 3 more, while the side door camera remained empty. Daniel muted the office lights in the hallway and walked back toward the door slowly, not because he planned to open it, but because it was impossible not to check. The sound did not repeat. He stood there for maybe 20 seconds and then heard something even worse. A slow scraping, like someone dragging a gloved hand down the outside metal of the door. He stepped back immediately, went to utility room, and grabbed a heavier flashlight and the steel pry bar from his tool bag. He was not exactly frightened yet, but he was alert in the way you get when you realize you may not be dealing with a simple equipment issue anymore. He returned to the monitor station. Side door camera still empty. That part kept bothering him. If someone was messing with him, they had to be standing somewhere the camera could not see. But the camera angle was wide enough that there was not much dead space except a few inches right against the wall. He convinced himself it was probably one person hugging the wall to avoid view. That would at least make human sense. Around 1 a.m., the building lights dimmed again, and the generator clicked over for a few seconds. This time, while it was running on backup, every phone in the office rang once at the same moment and stopped. Not fully rang, more like each handset gave off a single sharp chirp together. Daniel said it was one of the most unpleasant sounds he'd ever heard because it made the entire building feel occupied in a way it had not a second earlier. He checked the lines. No incoming call. No active signal. He reset the system anyway, then radioed the coordinator again. This time there was no answer. He tried the public safety frequency. Also no answer, though the storm by then was strong enough that radio quality had dropped. He considered just waiting until morning and doing nothing else, but the backup cycling was still a real problem, and he needed to isolate it if he could. He spent the next hour working in the utility room. At some point, he realized the building had gone very quiet. Not storm quiet, but interior quiet. No ticking vents. No settling sounds. No random office hum, except the low machinery noise in the walls. That silence was broken by a sound from the records room. A drawer closing. Not slamming. Closing. He set down his tools and listened. Nothing followed. He walked to the records room and found the door still shut. When he opened it, the light inside was off even though he was certain he had seen it on earlier during his first walkthrough. He flipped it on. Rows of metal filing cabinets. Archive boxes. Nothing else. But one cabinet near the back had a drawer sticking out by maybe 2 inches. He pushed it closed and looked at the label. Old council meeting records from years before. He checked the room more thoroughly than he wanted to admit to me, making sure no one was hiding between shelves or behind the stacked archive boxes. Nobody was there. He returned to the break room and decided to stay put until dawn unless the generator actually failed. A little before 3 a.m., he heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, not a run, not a stumble. Hard saws on commercial flooring. He sat absolutely still for a second, listening to them pass the break room door. Then they stopped. The break room door had a small wire glass window in it. Daniel stood up carefully and looked through. The hallway beyond was empty, but he could still hear what sounded like a presence just outside the door, subtle weight shifting. The kind of tiny sound you only notice when you are straining not to breathe too loudly yourself. He did not open it. After maybe 10 seconds, the weight shifted away. Then the footsteps resumed, moving farther down the hall toward the records room. He followed, but only after waiting long enough to make sure he was not about to step directly into someone. The hallway was empty again. Records room door shut. Utility room shut. Front office empty. Front entrance still locked. He checked the cameras. Nothing on any feed. By then, he was well past trying to explain everything calmly. He radioed again and finally got the coordinator, who sounded more awake this time. Daniel said there was definitely someone in or around the building. The coordinator asked if Daniel had opened the side door at any point after midnight. Daniel said no. The man was quiet for a second, and then asked a question Daniel found odd. He asked, "Did you hear walking before or after the phones?" Daniel said after. The coordinator swore softly and told him to do one thing: go to the front office, lock himself in, and wait for daylight. Daniel asked what was going on. The man said he would explain in the morning, and then signed off. That answer made everything worse, because it meant the coordinator was not surprised enough. Daniel took his laptop radio, flashlight, and pry bar and moved into the front office. From there, he could see the front entrance and part of the main hallway. He locked the office door and killed the overhead light, leaving only the desk lamp on. For a while, nothing happened. He started thinking maybe he had finally scared himself into hearing things. Then the side door alarm chirped again. Once. A pause. Then once more. The side camera feed remained empty. Daniel watched the monitor without blinking. About 15 seconds later, something changed on the screen. Not a person entering frame. More like the image itself shifted slightly, as though someone were standing too close to the camera lens and blocking part of the light. The screen darkened at one edge for maybe a second, then cleared. Immediately after that, he heard footsteps again, this time not down the main hall. Above him, slow walking overhead. The building had no second floor, just a low roof. Daniel said he felt cold all through his chest when he realized the steps were crossing from one end of the roof line to the other, directly over the front office. He checked the front camera. Nothing visible except snow blowing through the outer light. The roof sounds continued for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped right over the office. He was still looking up when something tapped the little wire glass window in the office door. One tap, then 2 more. He looked at the door. No one there. The hallway beyond looked empty. Then, very slowly, the shadow of something passed across the lower part of the glass from the outside. Not fully visible, just enough to tell that something had moved close to the door. Daniel gripped the pry bar and shouted that he was armed and that whoever was there needed to identify themselves. No answer. The shadow did not return. A few minutes later, from somewhere at the far end of the building, one of the office phones rang once. Then another phone in a different room rang once. Then a third farther away. Not together this time. Sequentially, like something moving through the offices and triggering them one by one. He stayed in the front office until the first gray light of morning showed faintly around the front door edges. When the coordinator and another man finally arrived, Daniel was waiting with his tools packed. They searched the building. No person, no forced entry, no damage locks, no footprints inside. Outside, the storm had drifted most of the open ground, but one thing remained visible near the sidewall, a shallow line of impressions in the snow, each about the length of a boot print, running close along the building from the side door toward the front offices. The coordinator looked at them and got a strange expression on his face, like he had hoped not to see that again. Daniel demanded an explanation. The coordinator finally told him the truth, or at least a local version of it. Years earlier, before upgrades and better heating, that same building had been used overnight during a severe storm when several adult residents were stranded away from the main part of the village. According to him, one man left the building in the middle of the night after becoming convinced someone outside was calling for help. Nobody else heard the voice clearly enough to make out words. They only heard him say that a person was knocking at the side door and asking to be let in. By the time anyone realized he was gone, the storm had buried his tracks. They found him the next day, a short distance from the side of the building. Exposure was the official cause. After that, people assigned to stay there at night sometimes reported odd things during winter storms. Knocking at the side entrance, false alarm trips, phones chirping, footsteps where no one should be. The coordinator said most locals refused to stay in the building alone after dark when weather got bad, which was why they had been happy to let an outside contractor monitor it overnight without saying much. Daniel got angry at that point, and I do not blame him. He said if they had warned him properly, he would have still done the job, but he would have approached the night very differently. The coordinator apologized and said they had not wanted to influence what he thought he was hearing. That explanation did not help. Daniel finished the repairs that morning and left on the earliest return trip, weather would allow. He told me he tried to put the whole thing behind him. For a while he almost did. Then, months later, he received a padded envelope at his home address with no return sender. Inside was a photocopy of an old incident report from the building. No note, no explanation, just a report. He assumed at first the coordinator had sent it as some kind of apology. The report described a night that man died. Most of it was dry and procedural. Times, weather, statements. But one line was underlined in pen by whoever mailed it. It was from the account of another adult who had been in the building that night. The line said, "He told us not to open the side door because he could already hear the person walking inside the hallway." Daniel showed me that page once and said that was the detail he could never shake. Not the knocking, not the footsteps on the roof, not the phones. The idea that whatever had been outside that storm had also, somehow, been heard inside before anyone opened anything at all. He quit that contract after the season ended. And the last thing he ever said to me about that place was that if he had opened the office door when the tapping came, he does not think he would have found an empty hallway. He thinks he would have found whatever made the man years earlier believe the safest place to go when a blizzard was out into it.